Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 25, in which a slight glimpse of San Francisco is had a political meeting. It was 7 o'clock in the morning when Phileas Fogg, Mrs. Aouda, and Passepartout set foot on the American continent, if this name can be given to the floating wharf on which they landed. These wharves, rising and falling with the tide, facilitate the loading and unloading of vessels. Clippers of all sizes were moored there, steamers of all nationalities, and those steamboats with several decks, which ply on Sacramento and its tributaries, were accumulated also on the products of commerce which extend from Mexico, Peru, Chile, Brazil, Europe, Asia, and all the lands of the Pacific Ocean. Passepartout, in this joy at finally touching American soil, thought in landing he would execute a perilous leap in his finest style. But when he fell upon the wharf, the planks of which were worm-eaten, he almost fell through, quite put out by the manner in which he had set foot on the new continent. The good fellow uttered a terrible cry, which sent flying an innumerable flock of cormorants and pelicans, the customary inhabitants of the movable wharves. Mr. Fogg, as soon as he landed, ascertained the hour of which the first train left for New York. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. He had, then, an entire day to spend in the California capital. He had ordered a carriage for Mrs. Aouda and himself, Passepartout mounted on the box, and the vehicle, at $3 for the trip, turned towards the International Hotel. From the elevated position that he occupied, Passepartout observed with curiosity that the great American city, the broad streets, low, evenly ranged houses, and the Anglo-Saxon Gothic churches and temples, the immense docks and the palatial warehouses, some of wood, some of brick, and the numerous vehicles in the streets, omnibuses and horse cars, and on the crowded sidewalk, not only Americans and Europeans, but also Chinese and Indians, the component parts of the population of more than 200,000 inhabitants. Passepartout was quite surprised at all he saw, yet it was in the city of 1849, in the city of bandits, incendiaries, and assassins, running after the native gold, an immense concourse of all the outlaws who gambled with gold dust, a revolver in one hand and a knife in the other. But this good time had passed away, and San Francisco represented an aspect of a large commercial city. The high tower of the city hall overlooked all these streets and avenues, and crossing each other with other at right angles, between which were spread out by verdant squares. Then a Chinese quarter, which seemed to have been imported from the Celestial Empire, in toy box. No sombreros or red shirts after the fashions of the miners, Indians, or with feathers, but silk hats and black clothes worn by a large number of gentlemen of absorbing activity. Certain streets among the Montgomery streets and the Regent Street of London, and the Boulevard d'Italien of Paris, in the Broadway of New York, the State Street, Chicago, were lined with splendid stores in whose windows were displayed products of the entire world. When Passepartout arrived at the International Hotel, it seemed to him that he had not left England. The ground floor of the hotel was occupied by an immense bar, a sort of sideboard open gratis by every passer-by. Dry beef, oyster soup, biscuit, and cheese were dealt out without the customer having to take out his purse. He only paid for his drink, ale, porter, or sherry, if he fancied refreshment. That appeared very American to Passepartout. The hotel restaurant was comfortable. Mr. Fogg and Mrs. Aouda took seats at a table, and were abundantly served in very small dishes by negroes of darkest hue. After breakfast, Phileas Fogg, accompanied by Mrs. Aouda, left the hotel to go to the office of the English consul to have his passport visaed there. On the pavement he found a servant who asked if it would not be prudent, before starting the Pacific Railroad, to buy a few dozen on-field rifles or Colt's revolvers. Passepartout had heard so much talk about the Sioux and Pawnees stopping trains like ordinary Spanish brigands. Mr. Fogg replied that it was useless precaution, but he left him free to act as he thought best, and he went to the office of the consul. Phileas Fogg had not gone 200 steps by when the greatest accident he met Fix, who manifested very great surprise. How Mr. Fogg and he had taken the voyage together across the Pacific, if they had not met on board the vessel. All At all events, Fix could only be honored by seeing again the gentleman who he owed so much, and his business calling him to Europe, he would be delighted to continue his journey in such an agreeable company. Mr. Fogg replied that the honor would be his, and Fix, who made it a point not to lose sight of him, asked he permission to visit him with his city as San Francisco, which he was granted. Mrs. Aouda, Phileas Fogg, and Fix sauntered through the streets, and they soon found themselves in Montgomery Street, where the crowd of people were so enormous, and on the sidewalks in the middle of the streets, on the horse-card rails, notwithstanding the incessant passages of coaches and omnibuses, on which the stores, in the windows of the houses, and even up to the roofs, there was an innumerable crowd. Men with placards circulated among the group, banners and streamers floated in the wind, and there were shouts in every direction. Hooray for Camerfield! Hooray for Amanda Boy! It was a political meeting, as least Fix thought, and he communicated his ideas to Mr. Fogg, adding, "We will perhaps do well, sir. There's not to mingle in the crowd, only hard blows will be gotten here." "In fact," replied Mr. Fogg, "blows, if they are political, are not less blows." Fix could not help smiling at this remark, and in order to see, without being caught in the crowd, Miss Aouda, Phileas Fogg, and he secured a place upon the upper landing of the flight of steps, and reached the top of the terrace. Situated in the upper end of Montgomery Street, before them, on the other side of the street, between the wharf of a coal merchant and the warehouse of a petroleum dealer, there was a large platform in the open air, towards which the various currents of the crowd seemed to be tending. And now, why this meeting? What was the occasion of being held? Felix Fogg did not know at all, and it was for the state of nomination of some high military or civil official, the state governor or a member of Congress? It might be supposed so, but seeing the great excitement agitating the city. At this moment there was quite a movement in the crowd, and every hand was thrown into the air. Some, tightly closed, seemed to rise and fall rapidly in the midst of the cries in an energetic manner. No doubt, on casting a vote, the crowd fell back and the banners wavered, disappearing in an instant, and reappeared in the tatters. The surging of the crowd extended to the steps, whilst every head moved up and down on the surface like a sea suddenly agitated by the squall. The number of black hats diminished perceptibly, and the most of them seemed to have lost their normal height. "It is evidently a meeting," said Fix, and the question which he had excited must be a stirring one. "I would not be astonished if they were still discussing the Alabama affair, though it has been settled." "Perhaps," replied Mr. Fogg. "In any event," replied Fix, "two champions are in each other's presence, the Hon, Mr. Camfield, and the Hon, Mr. Mannaboy." Mrs. Aouda, leaning on Phileas Fogg's arm, looked with surprise at this noisy scene. Fix was going to ask one of his neighbours the reason of this popular efference, and a more violent movement broke out. The hurrahs and spear with insults redoubled. The staffs of the banners were transformed to offensive arms. Instead of hands, there were fists everywhere. From top the carriages of omnibuses blocking in their course, the formidable blows were exchanged. Everything was made use of projectiles. Boots, shoes described extended curves in the air, but it seemed even as if some revolver mingled their national sounds with loud cries of the crowd. The crowd approached the knight of the stairs, and swept over into lower steps. One of the parties had evidently been repulsed without disinterested spectators knowing whether the advantage was with Mandiboy or Camerfield. "I believe that it is prudent for us to retire," said Fix, who did not want his man to get hurt or mixed up in a bad business. "If this is an English question, then we are recognized. If we will be treated roughly in this mixed crowd." "An English citizen," replied Phileas Fogg, but the gentleman could not finish his sentence. Behind him, on the terrace above the stairs, there were frightful yells. They cried, "Hip, hip! Hooray for Mandiboy!" and the party of voters coming to rescue, flanking the Camerfield party. Mr. Fogg and Mrs. Aouda found themselves between two fires. It was too late to escape. This torment of men, armed with loaded canes and bludgeons, was irresistible. Phileas Fogg and Fix, in protecting the young woman, were very roughly treated. Mr. Fogg, not less phlegmatic, as usual, tried to defend himself with the natural weapons placed at the end of his arms at every Englishman, but in vain. A large fellow with a red beard and a flushed face and broad shoulders, who seemed to be a chief of the band, raised his formidable fist to strike our Fogg, but he would have damaged that gentleman very much if Fix, throwing himself in the way, had not received a blow in his place. An enormous bump rose at the detective's once silk hat, transformed to a simple clock. "Yankee!" said Mr. Fogg, casting at his adversary a look of scorn. "Englishman," replied the other, "we will see each other again. When you please. Your name?" "Phileas Fogg." "And yours?" "Colonel Sam Proctor." And the crowd passed down. Throwing Fix down, he rose with his clothes torn, but without serious hurt. His traveling overcoat was torn into two unequal parts, but his pantaloons resembled those of certain Indians. But to sum it up, Miss Outwood had been spared, and Fix alone had been harmed by the fist blow. "Thanks," said Mr. Fogg to the detective, as they were out of the crowd. "No thanks necessary," replied Fix, "but come with me." "Where?" "To a tailor's." In fact, this visit was opportune. The garments of Phileas Fogg and Fix were in tatters, as if these two gentlemen had fought for the Hon, Messrs. Cammerfield and Mandiboy. In hours afterwards they had respectable clothes and hats, and returned to the International Hotel. Passepartout was waiting there for his master, armed with half a dozen sharpshooting, six-barrels, breech-loading revolvers, which he perceived Fix in company with Mr. Fogg. His brow darkened. Mrs. Aouda, however, having told in a few words what happened, Passepartout became calm again. Fix was evidently no longer an enemy but an ally. He was keeping his word. Dinner over, the coach drove up to take the passengers and their baggage to the station. They were getting into the coach. Mr. Fogg said to Fix, "Do you see Coroner Proctor again?" "No," replied Fix. "I shall return to America to find him again," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. "It would not be proper for an English citizen to allow himself to be treated in such a way." The detective smiled and did not answer him, but it seemed that Mr. Fogg was one of those Englishmen who, while they do not tolerate duelling at home, will fight abroad, in what is necessary to maintain their honour. At the before 6, the travellers reached the station and found the train ready to start. At the moment that Mr. Fogg was going to get into the car, he called a porter and asked him, "Was there not some disturbance in San Francisco today?" "It was a political meeting, sir," replied the porter, "but I noticed a certain excitement in the street." "It is simply a meeting organized for the election." "The election of General in Chief, doubtless?" asked Mr. Fogg. "No, sir, of the Justice of Peace." Upon this reply, Phileas Fogg jumped aboard the car, and the train started at full speed.